Hello Year 5, it's Mrs Bastable. I hope you're all looking after yourselves. I'm really looking forward to today's lessons, so let's get started. So today's target is to be able to understand what Victorian schools were like and compare them to schools today. To do this, you'll need to know some facts about schools in Victorian times and to think carefully about the equipment they used compared to what we have available to us today. Take a look at this photograph of some Victorian school children. Think about what they are wearing. In what ways do you think this is similar to how we dress for school today? And how is it different? Going to school in Victorian times was very different to school life today. In England, schools were not free until 1891. Until then, children had to pay to go to school. Poor children went to free charity schools or schools run by women called dame schools, or they also went to Sunday schools, which were run by churches. Children from rich families were educated at home until they were 10 years old, and then the boys were sent to public schools like Eton or Harrow. However, very few schools had availability for girls, so rich girls usually stayed educated at home. Queen Victoria, though, made many changes to schools to try to improve education, especially for the poor children. Victorians decided that all children should go to school and started to check that schools were giving the best education. They introduced laws to decide what children should and should not be expected to do, such as work. In 1880, a law was made to make sure that every child in Britain between the ages of 5 and 10 went to school. And here's a picture of a typical Victorian school. In what ways do you think it's similar to our schools? And how could you say it looks different? The classroom in Victorian times was sometimes known as the schoolroom. In the schoolroom, pupils sat at desks in rows facing the front. The windows of the schoolroom were high so that pupils could not look out, and the rooms would have been lit by gas lights. It was most likely a cold room, so you would have wanted to sit close to a fire. The walls would have been bare, but there might have been a large map of the world for you to look at. The school morning started at 9 a.m. and lasted until 12 noon. Children were then sent home for lunch and returned for afternoon classes, which ran from 2 p.m. until 5 p.m. There were no school lunches and sometimes no break times. Another thing to note is that classes in Victorian times were very large, with 40, 70, or in some cases even 100 pupils in one schoolroom. Take a look at this typical Victorian classroom. There wasn't a lot of space, and as we've already said, they didn't allow a lot of natural light. We're going to take a closer look now at some of the objects that you'd expect to find in a Victorian classroom, which have been labelled here. Think carefully as we look what alternative items we use to these today. Victorian children would have had a writing slate in their classroom. Children were taught to write at first with a tray filled with sand. They would copy a letter from the blackboard into the sand with their finger. All children had to write with their right hand. When they could form the letters, the children would then write on the slate board. The teacher would check the children's work, and then the children would wipe the slate clean. This is where we get the saying from, to wipe the slate clean. As children became older, they were taught to write in copperplate handwriting. Children had to copy words and sentences from a copybook. As they used pens, which had to be dipped into ink, it was easy for the ink to splatter on the page, and for this you would be punished. What is an abacus? So in maths lessons, children used frames with coloured wooden beads. These were called an abacus. Children learned how to multiply and to divide by using this apparatus. Have you ever seen one before? School desks. Children's desk had a seat attached to the desk. Two children would often sit together side by side. Some even had 3 or 4 children sitting at them together because there wasn't a lot of space. There were slots at the top of the desk where the children could put their slates. There would also be holes for holding inkwells. These would be filled up in the morning by the ink monitor. There was also a ridge along the top to keep pens and pencils from rolling off the desk. Books were placed on a little shelf underneath the desk. The teacher's desk was much higher, and so was the chair they sat on. This means that they would have a good view of all of the children all of the time. Sometimes the teacher's desk would have a cupboard at the front for storing books. The school bell was an actual bell that would ring at the beginning and at the end of lessons. The bell would also be rung at playtimes. The blackboard is the board that the teacher would write the work on for each lesson, and the children would have to copy it down onto their slate boards, or the older children in their writing books. Punishments in Victorian times were harsh, and it was no different for pupils in Victorian schools. Some reasons for punishments might be rudeness, leaving a room without permission, not telling the truth, laziness, or even missing school. Sometimes teachers used a cane. These were made from wood and they were used to hit children with. Boys were usually caned on their backsides and girls were caned across their hands or even their bare legs. Lessons in Victorian times were mostly made up of the teacher talking and the pupils listening or copying from the board. Learning was done by rote, which means that children chanted things over and over again, such as multiplication tables, until they knew them by heart. Children studied the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, which was maths. Pupils would also have studied history and geography. Girls and boys had different activities to do in afternoons. The girls were taught cooking and sewing, and the boys would have been taught woodwork. The children all took part in PE lessons called the drill. A drill involved the children lining up in their rows, stretching, swinging weights, and jogging on the spot or marching. Well, I can think of quite a lot of things that have changed, and mostly for the better, I'd say, wouldn't you? Here are some of the ideas I've came up with comparing school then, in dark blue, to now, in the lighter blue. So then, poor children and girls were not always educated. However, now, all children are expected to go to school for an education. Then they would have high windows that you wouldn't be able to see out of. Whereas now we tend to like classrooms with large windows and lots of daylight. Their classes would have been very large, often having more than 70 pupils in one room. Whereas now we prefer smaller classes if we can, and usually only up to about 30 children. Then they would have been at school until 5 p.m, whereas nowadays most schools finish between 3 and 3:30. They used blackboards with chalk to write on, whereas we use lots of interactive whiteboards and computers. But possibly most importantly, I think, in those days children were caned and beat by their teachers. And now, quite rightly, no children should be hurt by anybody at school, especially not by teachers. Can you think of any other similarities or differences? What I'd like you to do now is use what you have learned to make a comparison between life in Victorian schools and school life today. You could write this up in clear paragraphs, which would be wonderful, or you could complete a double-page spread if you'd like to include some artwork or drawings, as long as it is clear that you understand the differences. Then I'd like you to think about which type of schooling you prefer. Would you have liked to have been a Victorian child? Or are you quite happy that we have an education system like we do today? Now you have compared Victorian schools and modern day schools, I want you to think back to your target for today. How do you think you've done? Have you met the criteria? I'm sure you did. And please don't forget to share your work with us at school. Remember, you can WhatsApp us, email us, or post it in our new school post box. Well done today. I think it's amazing to see how far we've come with our education these days. I wonder what a Victorian child would think about a school today. I'll see you soon. Goodbye.